1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. A Nightmare on Elm Street completely redefined the sophisticated slasher horror film and is one of the best horror films that's ever been made. And stay tuned to the end since I'll reveal exactly how A Nightmare on Elm Street redefined the slasher horror film. If you're new here, I'm Jordan, and welcome back to my channel. I'm a narrative writer, director, and producer, and have been working in LA for the last 10 years. This channel is all about filmmaking techniques, the philosophy of art, creative and technical workflows, and what filmmaking can teach us about life. A Nightmare on Elm Street is one of my favorite horror franchises of all time and totally redefined the mid-80s slasher film by adding an intellectual component along with exploring dream logic. In each video in this series, I really want to analyze why writer and director Wes Craven has such a unique directing and writing style and how he totally redefined his own brand of horror. In this second video, we're going to break down Nancy's dream, that iconic bathtub scene, the Venice Canal scene with Johnny Depp, and Fred Krueger's past revealed with Nancy's mother. So with that set up, let's dive into the scenes. Nancy's dream sequence.
Disasters in the sun and the moist air.
The student at the front of the class is reading from Shakespeare's Hamlet, which also has some symbolic ties to what is actually happening within the plot of the film. One of the lines he says, especially toward the end of this scene, directly has to do with dreaming and the fact that the character won't be able to achieve the kingdom unless they wake up for a dream. But again, I'm a sucker for a good classroom sequence, especially an English classroom, and I think that's because my favorite subject in school was always English class. And I really like that we're showing Nancy starting to drift. But what's so great about the reality they set up in this film is it could be just a cut and now we're in a nightmare, and just a moment before we were in reality. So I like that it's never completely clear when we're vacillating between reality and the nightmares. And I think that's also a really smart setup of the way Wes Craven set up this world for this film, but also all the sequels to come. Also, this image of Tina in the body bag, there's blood all over her, but we can just barely see her face through the thin veil of the body bag. In some of the analysis I read, it said that this suggests the image of the Virgin Mary and that Tina is the Virgin Mary that's bloody when Nancy sees her. So I think this ties in again with the elements of some of the religious iconography that we're seeing, like the cross and the mention of God, especially when Tina says, "Help me, God." So I think it's very likely that that image right there is evoking that image of the Virgin Mary. And it's just a downright creepy image too, of the way it's shot. The cinematography looks amazing here. I really love just this image. It's so distinctive and stands out. So the guy speaking in the front of the class, his voice takes on now this more whisperish cadence with a little bit of reverb and echo on the sound design. And now it's clear nobody else in that class is looking out the hallway. Nobody else has seen Tina or heard what she said. So now it's very clear we're in Nancy's nightmare. The score, the sound design are all starting to bring us into this world that's getting more and more creepy by the minute, which I think is this nice progression of the levels of how we descend into the fear of the nightmare. It doesn't ramp up, but it moves very slowly. It brings us into that world. And I think this is a really nice choice instead of just thrusting us right into the nightmare, making it that much more easily detectable to the audience. I think these are smart and deliberate pacing choices that Wes Craven infused into the film and add a more palpable sense of dread as we go. I also really love Nancy's sweater vest. It's just peak 80s fashion, and I think it looks great. That's also one of my favorite shots from this whole film too, is we have this long trail of blood. I almost liken it to the breadcrumbs in Hansel and Gretel, that old fable where the witch is leaving all of these little pieces of a trail that the kids follow to their ultimate demise. So I think this is a similar thought, that there's a trail that's literally saying, hey, follow this. And of course, human curiosity usually always gets the better of us, and we end up following the trail when we know we probably shouldn't. But I love this image of Tina getting dragged by somebody who's off frame. And it also gives us evidence as to what created that blood trail in the hallway. So I like that there's a practical logic to this dream scenario. I also think it's a smart choice that we're in this long hallway. Again, the use of long, elongated spaces. There's nobody else in that hallway. And even though it feels like there's places she can run, I think in a lot of ways, it also feels very isolating in its own regard. When they first enter the dream, for any of the characters, they're often seeing a long alley or tunnel-like hallway, which feels consistent with the geography of the nightmare logic. This is one of my favorite lines in the film, where this other student, interestingly wearing a sweater that looks red and green, which very much resembles the Freddy sweater, not by coincidence. I love that she is basically saying,
"Where's your pass? Screw your pass."
I don't know if in the 80s in school it was that much more of a thing that you had to have a hall pass if you were ever walking around the hall, but there's a funny line at the end of this whole dream sequence that comes back around, and the teacher also mentions the hall pass too. So I think it's a funny line that just showcases how frivolous the hall pass is, but so many people in this school clearly take it seriously. So I love that Nancy also, we're starting to see her slowly but surely start to take ownership of her own art and her own engagement within this film. She says, "Screw your hall pass." So I think we see Nancy starting to slowly fight back against Freddy, but this nightmare dream logic. And I think this is something that makes her such a great final girl, a great protagonist, is she's not just gonna sit down and take it. She's actively fighting back with the way she responds. And we can tell that she is worked up and she's terrified, but she's also willing to engage aggressively. So I think this is something that makes us want to root for her even more as an audience, is seeing the fight within her.
Hey, Nancy. No running in the hallway.
And with each shot, we're starting to add more and more subtle layers. It still looks like the school hallway, but now we have leaves. This student has scratches on her face in red, and she has the iconic glove with the knives that Freddy uses. So I think we're slowly adding one element at a time. And I really like how progressive the descent into the nightmare is. It's very much controlled and it has a purpose to every shot. There's something that's so symbolic and elegant about the way when Nancy is often entering the boiler room here and later in the film, she's descending a set of stairs. And I love that there's a visual representation of the descent into hell, which I would call the boiler room. And I think every time she's entering, it's always going downward. So I think it supports that idea. Again, if we're using the religious iconography of Freddy in a way is the devil, the boiler room is hell, and there's the reliance on hopefully God will save them, and there's the crosses, but in something that's so simple as her opening a curtain and now we are in that boiler room. This dream logic is such that it's believable that she can turn any corner and that space can totally transform to a different location. So I think, again, it feels practical but believable that when she opens this curtain, now she's in the boiler room. So I think that just feels logical based off the dream logic, that a lot more is possible than it would be if we're in reality. This is the first time in the film that we're seeing how Nancy is seeing the full version of Freddy. And I like that this is more of a prolonged sequence because we're sticking with Nancy's point of view here, and they're using these sound effects. They do sound very 80s, but it feels consistent with the language of the film. And this is really where we see more and more of Freddy, especially a full shot of him. He steps out of the shadows. These are some of the iconic shots that we think of when we think about Freddy Krueger, especially in the context of this film. I also just want to give a shout out to Jim Doyle and the whole crew who worked on the practical effects, the special effects on this film. It is just downright disgusting that he claws open his chest. There's worms and there's green in there, all practically done and just outright disgusting. Again, I want to emphasize how incredible this boiler room location is. It looks so incredibly realistic, like a real boiler room with scaffolding and corners, and there's a bunch of barrels and tubes. And this serves so many great visual choices from a directing standpoint, because you can have a character hide, you could have Freddy hide almost anywhere in there. There's a lot of pockets of shadow and there's a lot of pockets of light. And I think it's natural that we're bringing back the Wes Craven follow shot where Nancy's running away from Freddy. But we're getting to explore more and more of this boiler room. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we're finally seeing more of the location when Nancy is in this dream, because again, she's our protagonist. So she's almost our eyes and ears into a lot of other elements of the film. So as she's discovering it, she's almost taking us with her as an audience to discover it at the same time. They're also playing around with the rules of the dream logic, and that the curtain that she entered from is now a brick wall. She can't go anywhere else after. And I love that there's this use of space changing and the geography is totally warping around her. And now she has really no way out. It's almost trapping her from the inside out, as if Freddy is just the puppet master pulling the strings. And one other thing I'll note about the score here is they added this beat that's actually kind of a banger, if I'm being honest. I don't think you would really ever see this kind of song that has a beat to it, a percussive beat, in any horror film and modern day filmmaking that I can recall, unless it's a needle drop. But I think it's an interesting choice that almost adds this energy to the scene. And I think that's what it's doing, is it's bringing us from a place of anticipatory tension into now we're feeling the energy of the scene. We almost have our heart racing. We feel like we almost want to get up and move and maybe dance. And I think that's matching almost the energy rhythm of what Nancy's feeling as she's running around, her heart's racing. So I like that we see it here. It's such an 80s choice. Some really great use of course, the sound design with that horrible screeching. It's like nails on a chalkboard, which I've always hated. So I think it just further serves to make you feel uncomfortable. I think you see a little more in 80s filmmaking is this use of the underlight. So the light source is under the actor pointing up at them, and it gives it that creepier, almost glow on their face. It's how they used to light a lot of the old monsters back in the old days. Most of the time we see Freddy in the film, in the boiler room, his full face is obscured. There's always just parts of his face we're seeing. He's in shadow so much of the time. Freddy being this kind of sexual predator or violating the teen's sexuality in certain ways, especially with this gesture of his tongue. I really want to highlight Heather Langenkamp's performance as Nancy here when she comes back into the real world, and I love that she burns herself to bring herself back into the real world instead of letting Freddy just take her. Again, she's becoming more and more active by the moment, which is a great arc for a protagonist, is passive to active, and she is really taking her destiny into her own hands to say, I am doing whatever I need to wake myself up, to bring myself into the real world so that Freddy will not get me in my nightmares. And when she is screaming and coming back to the fore in the classroom, she does an incredible job on that performance. I mean, again, the quality of the scream, the intensity she brings to it. A lot of her performance in the film doesn't have this sheer intensity all the time, but when it comes out, and it does come out a couple other times in this film, I think it makes us feel all the more empowered by her, and the fact that she isn't just going to take this. She is a very powerful protagonist in this film. The way she's screaming about in the class, it puts the hairs on my forearm on end because of just how visceral and primal it is. So, and again, I'm not sure if some of the quality of the screams and the vocals that we hear with the microphones they were using back then, obviously a lot of the tech and the microphones and the cameras weren't as sharp or crystal clear as we would have now. But I think in some ways it adds a little more of a raw element to the cinematography, but also the sound.
Yeah, go straight home. You'll need a hall pass.
This line makes me laugh because I think it's meant to infuse a little bit of humor and levity here after this very intense nightmare. So the teacher character in this film is played by Lin Shaye, who's also a staple in the Insidious horror films by James Wan. It's just funny that there's such an emphasis on this hall pass, which really is such a silly thing when you think about it. The bathtub scene Entering the scene, I like that we're building tension so early on because we see her slowly starting to fall asleep. We know how dangerous it is when any of these teens fall asleep in the film based off the reality they've set up. And I also think it's really smart that she's singing the song, meaning she probably heard it in the dream. And she's singing it to herself as she's starting to fall asleep, further supporting the idea that it is this disturbed lullaby that is easing her into the sleep that she should absolutely avoid. This is one of those iconic shots that is equal parts disturbing, but also so iconic. And I think there's no way to really debate that there's kind of a clear metaphor with the shot here that she's laying in the tub, her legs are spread, claws are coming out, Freddy's coming for her. So I very much think this supports the idea of he is this predator on many levels, but especially there's this idea of violation. I think this is one of those shots that really defined this film franchise and is one that you often see in a lot of different pop culture references to this film.
Nancy?
What, Mother?
Don't fall asleep in there. You could drown, you know.
For one, her waking Nancy up saves her from Freddy was just about to grab her, further building the suspense. And I think Wes Craven does do a really good job a few times in this film of setting up a possibility of the horror to come, and then he delays it, go back to normal for a second, he adds levity, and then he takes us right back to that place, which I think is a great quality of great filmmakers, especially in the horror genre. So I think he very much understands the push and pull of the prolongation of tension and suspense. So prolonging these things makes it all the more tense for us as the audience watching.
Oh, for Pete's sakes.
What happens all the time?
And I also really like that the line from the mother here is in a way can be read as infantilizing, since she says,
I've heated up some warm milk for you, honey.
typically when you have warm milk, it's because you're a baby or you're a younger kid who needs to have it before they go to bed. Traditionally, we come to learn later in the film why the mother has some of these overprotective measures, but I also think it's just a line that further serves the divide between the teens and their parents. In a horror film is all the more scary because the parents are actively not protecting the kids, but not believing them, not giving them the support that they need, especially when they're in danger. One thing I really do enjoy about Heather's performance here is when she reacts to the warm milk question, she scoffs at it and says it with such an eye roll that it feels like a real teenager would say something like this to a comment like that.
I've heated up some warm milk for you, honey.
Warm milk.
But it further serves to showcase that she's not just going to take it, even from her parents. I really like the design of this scene. I think it's a cool designed scene where we have this idea of Freddy's pulled her under the water. There's a very shallow hole that has a little bit of light shaft coming through. It's almost as if she's diving in a cave and the only source of light is this one pool of light toward the surface. And I believe the way they shot this, they had a standing bathtub set and they built the bathtub over an actual pool under it. So that way they could get the camera, they could get the light. There was room for Heather and the other actress to actually come through once they're pulled under. So I think that's the way that they achieved it. But there's a part also where we see a little bit of nudity, and it's interesting. This is actually a stunt double that they put in Heather's place. That's not Heather's body. Good that they did this responsibly. I also think there's a nice push-pull again here where we cut back and forth between the mother at the door trying to get in, Nancy in the tub struggling and fighting for her life to not be drowned. It prolongs the scene, it adds further tension. We're dying to know if she's gonna make it out alive or if she's not gonna make it. So I think this is also really smart editing choices for this scene. I think an interesting choice here too in the writing and directing is that Nancy very quickly downplays how much danger she was just in to her mother. I think what that showcases to us is at this point in the film, she very much still does not fully trust her mother. She's not fully convinced that her parents will actually be helping her. And I think that's important because it makes her feel even further isolated and feel like there's even less people that she can turn to for help as Freddy is getting closer and closer to really confronting her.
Are you okay? I'm okay. But I heard you screaming. You were calling me. I just was getting out of the tub.
One last line from the mother too to point out is she says,
I'll turn down your bed, okay? Alright, I'll get my pajamas on. Okay.
insinuating she's about to tuck her in, further serving this idea that she is almost babying her, infantilizing to a degree. And this is something I think Nancy very much is not appreciating. Well designed, I think it's creepy, bringing us into this world and doing it practically, and further just serving what the dream logic is able to achieve when the teens are in the nightmare. Venice Canal scene. So this scene was shot at the famous Venice Canals in Venice Beach, California. They're first having a conversation, again, about ways to avoid falling asleep, and eating causes drowsiness. And I'm personally a big fan of slow zooms. That was a technique that became really popular in 70s filmmaking. You don't see that quite as often in contemporary filmmaking, but I think it's something that just slowly brings us in. I think it's a way to center the viewer, but doing it slowly and gradually.
Whenever I get nervous, I eat.
You can't do that, you sleep.
Focusing in on what is the scene really going to be about as we get closer to the people having the conversation. I think it almost always works if you do it, especially early in the scene, to establish where we're moving towards.
Did you ever read about the Balinese way of dreaming?
This monologue from Johnny Depp is especially important because he's talking about the Balinese dream skills and how in their culture, dreaming and incorporating it into the literature is such a big part of it. But also when they encounter a monster, they simply turn their back on it and it removes all the power of that monster or demon within the dream.
This whole system they call dream skills.
So as we'll come to see later in the series, this is something that Nancy absolutely utilizes in her final fight with Freddy.
What if they meet a monster in their dreams? Then what?
They turn their back on it, take away its energy, and it disappears.
So I think the scene is extremely important because of what it establishes that will be paid off later about the key to taking away Freddy's power and ultimately defeating him. So the book that Nancy's reading is
Booby traps and improvised anti-personnel devices?
This is also extremely significant because later on in her final fight with Freddy, this is something she actually utilizes. She physically sets up these booby traps in order to trap Freddy. And it's a nice inversion of typically throughout the film, Freddy is luring people into his lair to trap them.
Well, what are you reading that for?
I'm into survival.
This also further solidifies Nancy's fight within her and her fighting spirit of determination to take down Freddy instead of just feeling helpless. I really like that she actually has a solution mindset here. She has a book of booby traps. She's focused, as she says in her final line, she's focused on survival. So she's willing to do whatever it takes to make sure she does make it through this, in contrast with, I think, a lot of the other teens and characters in this film. So again, another great reason why she's a great protagonist choice in the qualities that she possesses, and it further makes us root for her more and more, makes us feel like she actually has a chance against Freddy as the film goes on. Freddy Krueger's past revealed. I really like this scene in part because it's going to eventually lead to some important exposition, but I love the fiery nature and performance from Heather as Nancy. We can tell that she is just fed up with the behavior of her mom and her parents and everyone around her. We see how intensely this is affecting her. And again, that fiery spirit, the fighting spirit that we're coming to root for is only getting solidified here by the minute.
What's with the bars? Security. Security from what?
And in contrast, her mother, played by Ronnie Blakely, is so nonchalant. She's medicated. We also know that she is an alcoholic. A lot of this film, she's been drinking. She's had a huge bottle of vodka near her. And I think this very much leads to the two different philosophies of her mother would rather escape from reality by medicating with alcohol, and Nancy would rather face it head on. And in a way, it's inverting the roles and making it feel like Nancy is a little bit more of the parental figure here than her mother. Nancy is now starting to have to take care of herself and her mother because her mother just doesn't even want to deal with it anymore.
Come down to the cellar with me and I'll tell you.
This scene explains the most important piece of backstory that perhaps we need to understand the whole setup of the film and Freddy's motivation. And we reveal from the mother that Fred Krueger was a real child murderer who actually lived.
You want to know who Fred Krueger was? He was a filthy child murderer who killed at least 20 kids in the neighborhood.
He would take his victims to this abandoned boiler room, which all makes sense with why Freddy's still taking his victims to a boiler room to kill them.
It drove us crazy when we didn't know who it was. But it was even worse after they caught him.
And because Freddy got off from the charges because of some error in the legal system, the parents took mob justice into their own hands.
They put him away. Somebody forgot to sign the search warrant in the right place, and Krueger was free just like that.
Burning him alive just so they could seek their own form of justice.
A bunch of us parents tracked him down after they let him out.
This very much explains why the mother is so overprotective in ways,
Him in an old abandoned boiler room where he used to take his kids.
but also not as worried or concerned as we think she should be, because
Took gasoline. We poured it all around the place and made a trail of it out the door.
she thinks he's gone for good.
Then lit the whole thing up and watched it burn.
She knows they killed the actual man. There's no way he could actually be back.
But he can't get you now. He's dead, honey, because Mommy killed him.
And I think it's symbolic that she keeps the actual glove that he used when he was actually killing children in their own basement, which is like their own version of the boiler room.
I even took his knives.
And she keeps it just to show he can't come back. We got him. He's gone for good. So this very much sets up a reason why Freddy's doing what he's doing. Is in a way he's coming back to come for the children as revenge for what the parents did to him when he was still alive.
Still okay now.
So in a way, I interpret it as the sins of the parents before them is coming back to haunt their children and maybe their children after. So I think it speaks to this idea of generational curses and generations before having major impacts on current generations, especially adolescents. So this scene is a really good example of how it really represents how the sins of our parents before us can often lead to impacting us even in the present day.
You can sleep.
And even though this film was shot in the 80s and sometimes the style of acting was a little bit different than contemporary acting, it wasn't always as hyper naturalistic, and it is a little bit more earnest in some ways. I really think the performances between Ronnie Blakely playing the mother and Heather Langenkamp playing Nancy is really beautifully delivered. I really feel like this is one of the first times in the film that the mother's being completely honest with Nancy, and I think it really does actually allow us to see that while Nancy's shocked, she does appreciate this is bringing her closer to her mother, and this is something that's cathartic for both of them, that both of them very much needed to hear. So I think the way they perform it and cover it is really well done, and especially Ronnie Blakely playing the mother, I really feel for her here and feel her performance through the screen. I think this is definitely one of the better performance moments in the whole film. That concludes part 2 of how Nightmare on Elm Street completely redefined the slasher horror film. I want to hear from you. Comment below your favorite memories of the first time you watched Nightmare on Elm Street, or let me know what your favorite scene is below. For more movie breakdowns, check out more of my videos like this series that I did on The Ring, which you can find here, so check it out. And stay tuned for next week, where we'll continue to break down different scenes from A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I'll continue to make the case as to why it redefined the slasher horror film. So I will definitely see you then.